Hi, 1114 students. Today we're going to do just a little bit of basic soldering. So if you can watch this little video snippet before we begin the lab, that'd be great. If not, well, maybe you can look at it after the lab and gain something. First couple things on the table there is the solder. Now, there's a variety of different solders out there, and I'll let you read the chapter in a book that describes them all, but I'll say a few things about it. One, I've got two different solders here, and let's zoom in on this a little bit. There, now you can see that we've got two different diameter solders. I'll move this over here. Okay, this one here is a little bit bigger around than this one over here. So, what size solder do you use to solder? Well, if you're soldering the skinny wire, use the skinny solder. If you're soldering fat wires, do the fat solder. That's my advice there. Now, a couple other things about the solder. If you note, this says rosin core. I don't care if it's made in Mexico or not, but we've got rosin core. That's important for electrical solder. You do not want to use anything that has acid core for electrical soldering. Acid core, that's to stick metal to metal. It doesn't really matter as far as being good conductive-wise. But for electric conductivity, we want to make sure that we don't have acid core. Acid's going to end up eating away at the copper, and eventually it's going to start to corrode things, so we don't want to mess with that. So rosin core solder is what you want. Another thing is 60-40. Okay, now 60-40, 60% tin, 40% lead. In my opinion, that's probably the best all-around general type electrical solder. If at all possible, avoid the lead-free solders. I'm not saying that they're not good, but if you are just beginning soldering, I think you're going to have an easier time soldering with lead solder. And then maybe you can graduate into the non-leaded solder. Non-leaded solder, obviously without lead in it, it's going to be safer for the environment and for your health, I suppose. Okay, solder's kind of out of the way. Next thing we talk about is what we're going to use to solder with. Now, I've got a couple devices here. One is a butane-powered soldering pencil. Okay, and this, it's butane. Again, butane burns, so I have to light this. I'm not going to show you how to do it here, but we'll do this in the lab. This is kind of nice because there's no extension cord and I can pretty much solder wherever I want to. However, some of the dangers, if you have any type of flammable liquids or gases around, this is bad because it can catch them on fire and explode, and well, then your solder job is no good. The other problem, this particular one has an exhaust port here. Now, this eventually is a flameless heat. Inside here we have a little catalytic converter which is going to glow, and the flame kind of dissipates, goes away. It's feeding the air and the butane gas into this very, very hot catalytic converter, and it oxidizes it, makes lots and lots of temperature for us, and it works very well. But this exhaust port has a lot of gas that comes out of there. It is high temperature, and again, if you're not careful, even if you are careful, you're liable to catch some things on fire or melt things. So those are kind of the drawbacks to using this. I will say that some manufacturers, if they allow you to do any type of soldering work on their airbag harnesses, they recommend that you stay away from electric soldering irons and that you use the butane type soldering iron, so that you don't have any type of stray or transient voltages possibly going in and taking or setting off an airbag. So, get the propane out of the way. I'm not going to use it. I'm going to use this guy right here. There it is. This thing been around for 100 years, not this particular one, but I've got an ancient one at home that I still use. Works very well, kind of old reliable. I don't have to worry about gas. I don't have to worry about setting explosive gases to flame, but the big drawback to this is the cord. If my work, the solder that I'm doing, is 25 feet away from an extension there, I might not have a 25-foot extension cord to allow me to do the solder. So again, that's the big drawback to this. The thing I like about it though is that it heats up very quickly and I can control it pretty well. It is heavier, it's a little bit harder to handle if you've got a sprained wrist or something like that. But again, it works very well, and I like using it to teach just the beginning soldering. It's a trigger on there. You're going to pull the trigger, and what's going to happen then is the tip right here is going to get hot enough to melt the solder. Now, let's talk a little bit about that. As far as heating things go, this is going to get very hot, and I'm going to need to apply a little bit of solder to the tip there. In fact, that's one way you know that this is hot enough, when the solder begins to melt on it. One of the things we run into with metals and getting them very hot is that they tend to oxidize then more readily, meaning it's going to combine with oxygen in the air, and well, if it doesn't rust is oxidation. That's what cast iron and steel kind of does when it oxidizes, but other metals will oxidize also. So if we get a lot of oxidation on the metals, then the solder tends not to adhere to it, or stick, as we say. So we need to make sure that we can keep these as clean as possible. Now, another thing that we do, I have a little sponge in a container. You might see these with certain soldering kits. This is to get water. You put water on your sponge, and then when you heat up your tip, initially put the solder on, you're going to basically wipe the excess solder off on a wet sponge, or what I prefer, just a damp rag. So I've got a damp rag here, and what I'm going to do now is I am going to tin my soldering tip. So this is something you want to do anytime, especially if you get a brand new soldering iron, soldering gun. Make sure that you tin the tip. Now I'm going to squeeze the trigger, going to get him hot, and while I do that, I'm going to zoom in, so hopefully we can see the tip right there. All right, there's the tip. He's sort of thinking about, there we go, now it's focused. I'm going to apply some solder. There we go. You see how that solder melted? And the smoke. Okay, that smoke, we've got that core that we talked about, the rosin core. Rosin core, that is a flux. Any of you have done any welding, you know that flux is going to be there to kind of promote the flow of the solder. But it's also going to be there to prevent oxidation from occurring while this is hot and we continue to solder. So again, the flux is very important. Again, it's going to promote the flow, and we'll see that when we try to solder some wires.